So two little things, no, not little things, but two things. First thing is, if you really enjoyed a talk today or yesterday and you're thinking that maybe this would be something that you'd like your students to hear or your friends to hear, that really fancy thing in the back there has been recording every word that's been said, and we'll be editing these videos with over, I guess, the next few weeks, and then they will all end up on the BCRN website, which is just bcrn.berkeley.edu. And so you can see the talks, and eventually there'll be Sandy will be crafting a summary of the conference, and we are doing this so it is a resource for the field. There's also the full set from last year's conference up as well, and we're hoping that you'll sort of say, hey, I heard that really interesting talk, and that you will share it and find this to be useful. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is we're joined for our last brainstorming session by Catherine Carson, who's right here. And Catherine's the Associate Dean in the Social Science Division, and they really are the reason that we have this BCRN. It was originally a lunch, I think, that you sponsored at the faculty club 3 or 4 years ago, and got a bunch of us together, and then sort of gave us some financial support over the ensuing 2 years. And so I just wanted to thank Catherine. She's really been a huge supporter of this, and if you found this to be kind of an unusual experience and something that memorable, and for you, it certainly was for us. A lot of the credit and thanks go to them. So.
I'd like to say something on behalf of Carla. Yeah, because this experiment that BCRN is, this kind of charismatic organization that you guys have put together, this, interesting structure called a network, and all of the excitement that you've generated around it is one of the reasons we're very interested in hearing about your observations about how this has pulled together people from different research disciplines, and also where some of the noise in the network is, where there are strong links and where there are weaker links, where your sense of what this network could do has changed as you've gone through this process, because we would really like to learn how to develop other kinds of charismatic networks like you've put together here. And so I'm watching here as an empirical social scientist also to understand, is this scalable? Is this reproducible? And what does it take to make it work? And so I hate to say that you're part of the experiment. I'm watching as the scientist who is interested in seeing what comes out. But I'm so delighted on behalf of Carla Hesse to be here watching.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again. So now we have another intervention we have to design. Okay. So Ron's going to take over and lead us through this last phase.
So I'm really looking forward to having this time to reflect as a group. It's been an amazing couple days and quite a range of talks. I mean, I think there are a couple principles, to get back to your question, that I think are well captured in this meeting as well as in what we've been doing. And that is the yin and the yang to, on one hand, the openness and creativity and bringing in so many different levels from linguistics to economics to neuroscience. And the second is how to have a focus, how to really slice into the complexity across these levels and come up with tractable questions, and questions that matter to public health, matter to clinical intervention, matter to thinking about policy. And this ability to have both the flexibility and breadth and creativity to bring in these different disciplines, and yet the discipline to say, okay, well, what's the science that could move this forward? Are there really testable hypotheses? Are there models that can emerge that wouldn't have without this group? And I think that as the broad theme of, I think, how this group has struggled and to some degree succeeded is a bit of what we'd like to do in this last couple hours. And that is, I would want to start with whoever wants to volunteer, and hopefully we'll get most of the faculty, most of the speakers to comment on this. What I'd like to ask is, having heard the presentations today and yesterday and the discussion yesterday, What emerged for you as an attractor, as a line of investigation, line of question, or a link between two approaches that you think really generates excitement or possibility for an interdisciplinary group to tackle? That it raises questions that the right science, the right kind of studies, the right kind of innovative approach could really have impact. And again, some of this is going to be intuitive. It's going to be a gist process of what you, or it could be literal, analytic approach. But I'm interested, I think particularly from people who, not a part of our group, but coming into this, what some of your thoughts are about what emerges. It's like, wow, that's not something I would have thought about before, or having reflected on this or heard people discuss this. Even if it's not what I do, this set of questions seems like it could really be an important way to go. So again, I just want to throw that out, and if there are volunteers who want to go first, or actually, I know, Adriana, you have to leave soon for your plane, so I might actually get you to start off. Just plus,
I need a minute.
well, okay.
No, keep going. Yeah.
So, not to put you on the spot, but you can free associate.
Monica wants to go.
Okay, Monica wants to go. Yes, Monica wants to go.
That's not right. For me, at least today, I was listening to Val's talk, and to some extent, the idea of fitness seems fairly easy, right? You tell people become more fit, and you'll age better, and it seems like a fairly simple message. But I find myself, even when I give talks to retirement centers, retirement communities, that I'm still preaching to the choir, because most of the people in there are not the ones that need to hear this. They already do that, or even if they hear, they fairly quickly understand maybe a simplified version of the data and are on board. The people who need it are the ones that don't get this message. And I was thinking of maybe the possibility of bridging this fuzzy logic theory and gist to transmit this message, and exactly how to do it to people that do need it. Like if you think, this is Berkeley, it's wonderful to walk outside. If you're in the Midwest, the place where you can walk some months of the year is the mall. And there are all these fast food in there that are not good for you. So usually it doesn't quite work the same way. And if you're poor and obese and use your car to go everywhere, I mean, it's not that easy to make that message stick and to make the transformation of life. And that's at the individual level. At the policy level, I always, if I wear a pedometer and I'm in Europe, at the end of the day, just doing what I normally do, I get 10,000 steps. If I do the same in the US, I get 3,000. 10,000 is what you should get to have a healthy sort of fitness level. So there are both policy things that might change, like how cities are built and where your stores are that you could walk to as opposed to take the car to. Everybody that comes from Europe to visit me, they think it's funny to go to the bank and the laundromat and the pharmacy by car. You are at the window, you don't get out of your car. I mean, but that's how it's built. So those things could change. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, except to say that I think that the message about fitness, which again, it's in some ways simple because you could just ask people to walk more. It's not that easy to transmit, and maybe, I don't know if you have any thought. I'm now passing the bucket about how to go to people that are actually not quite there.
I completely agree. I do think there is, I think what you said strikingly contrasts, though, the nature of getting out facts about public health versus getting it. Yeah. And that is exactly the distinction I'm trying to transmit. And so, there's an old saying in learning, start where the learner is. So if you think about people as sort of generating a bottom line gist from the message you're trying to deliver, you should think about who is listening. Where are they coming from, that sort of thing, and do they really get the meaning of what you're saying? People can parrot back the facts, and I think a lot of people can parrot back some of the helpful public health facts, but that doesn't mean that they get the meaning or significance, the bottom line for themselves. And I think it seems as almost that's redundant, but it isn't, right? Because you go to the messages and you say, okay, what's the point of this public health message that's on the web? And people will tell you, well, we really don't know, we just put all the facts up. Well, if there's no point to the message, then we can't convey that point if we don't know what it is. So I think you're right that is one thing we can think about translating that for people and given different kinds of backgrounds of experience and culture and so on, because that will, of course, obviously influence the gist that they get.
As I always learn so much from Valerie, and it really, your talk really made me think about getting it in terms of gist-based meaning, but also coming back to our conversation yesterday about internal rewards, not to dichotomize internal versus external reward, but how we value things, and if there's such a thing as gist-based value, how does that happen? Is that not to be negative, is that impossible to do? To have people value things that we think are worth valuing, and how does that happen? So
this is something I've done some research on, and I think most of our values are gist-based. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we were talking about medical decision-making over lunch and how we want to make patient-centered decision-making, and we talked about how people construct values. I think people have some core values. They're not articulated at the level of some precise thing that we might ask in an experiment, but people will, value their family, value their health, value their mobility. People have those kinds of values, and I think if we think about how we represent the options we have in life, as agents who are free in the world, and then we think about values, I think we can communicate with people on that level. I think people often do not recognize how the situation is relevant to their values. Again, that seems so simple. I think what we're saying sounds so, but just having the insight that the value that you hold dear is actually relevant to this concrete situation is a big step forward in making better decisions.
So let me just add another layer that came up a couple times in the discussion to what was outlined really nicely. One is that, and as one of the first comments you made, Monica, is that this idea that earlier periods of development, like adolescence, could actually set up some of these tendencies later, and I think coming back to that. But I want to now come back to what we were just talking about in terms of these valuing-based systems and the self-relevant component of that, which again sometimes was implicit and sometimes explicit. So when you used your example of, showing the person's actual face aged as the powerful impact to get some future gist, the idea that in adolescence, some of these self-relevant representations are so plastic and being molded, and lots of people have studied this in lots of ways. And so this idea that some of the influence on these valuing systems, not as scripts or narratives, but this at the gist level, what deeply has meaning, where you don't calculate whether there are how many bullets in the gun. You just say, I'm not playing Russian roulette. This is just this gist. And I think the idea that some of those could be more influenced in impactful, enduring ways during periods of development like adolescence that may then play out, as you said, Monica, some of these people who have aged so well, you say, well, it's good genes or good habits, but some of it may be that some of these things were set in place early. And so if we get back to the focus of the behavior change group, where are the places that we can, what are the leverage points, the inflection points where the right nudge, the right mechanistic understanding of what's happening can have a big impact. And I think that's what we're often seeking. And it seems to me like we're identifying an attractor here that could be rich to investigate. But.
So in the work that Monica was presenting, I think it was, we were seeing these cross-sectional results, kind of point-in-time differences between people who have versus have not maintained a high level of fitness. And that was presumably, if we interpret it all as causal, kind of the result of a lifetime of accumulation of this kind of lifestyle. And I'm wondering, how much do we know about the effects so how long does it take for these differences to become large in the brain? So do we have any hope of measuring the effect of an intervention? Say we get a bunch of people to exercise more, would we be able to measure that in their brain function in a reasonable amount of time, or would we have to wait 10 years for the results to come out? And then kind of following on in that, there's not only does greater brain function have kind of health benefits, but there's growing awareness in economics about the effects of cognitive decline on economic decision making later in the lifestyle. And if you could kind of measure the effect of fitness on brain function, or a fitness intervention on brain function, you could measure not only the health effect, but also the financial effect, or kind of the financial decision-making effect, and that would potentially tip some of the cost-benefit analyses of how much are we willing to spend on these kinds of interventions for our elders, because it's not just the health benefit, but it's also going to kind of prevent them from being in abject poverty in their 80s or what have you.
So the data are there, at least some intervention data are there, and suggested about 6 months of exercise, meaning walking 3 times a week. So it's not marathon running or anything. It's from people that are totally couch potatoes, okay, that are really not exercising, seems to tip the scale, both cognitively in terms of neuropsych results and in terms of brain gains. So you actually have either a reversal or loss or an increase in areas that have shown thinning. Likely, and that's, again, my research area is more on the mechanism, likely because there is angiogenesis in those areas that are, first not as well perfused by blood. So that might be the volumetric change that you're seeing. I don't know of anybody who's done research on economics effects, but if you change executive function results for the better, you probably are going to change economic decisions for the better, because those are needed usually to make those kinds of high-level reasoning that you need for economics.
I guess my follow-up question to that is how big are the magnitudes that these studies are finding, and how well-powered are the studies so that,
They vary from tiny to probably 100 to 200 people. So they're not, that you have to do MR in the study that Art Kramer has done. This is not my research, it's Art Kramer's. They're costly, and you have to put like 100 people through before and after MRIs, which is expensive, plus the neuropsych, plus the exercise intervention. So they cost quite a bit of money, but the effect sizes are significant with those numbers. And there is an interesting study that was done, again, not my study. There is an experience core at Johns Hopkins. I think Carson is the PI for that. And they did a mini study where they took people that were particularly at risk. That's the interest I had in so people that lived in women that had a lot of sign of close to conversion to, at least mild cognitive impairment, so age 60 plus, overweight, undereducated, in poor neighborhood, so you name it. This is not a large group. This is now like 10, 12 people, I think, in that study. And they put them through a program that taught them how to be helpers in elementary school. So there's a different type of intervention. When instead of saying exercise, now this is embedded in sort of life, because you have to go somewhere and do something and be with kids that will make you move around because they move. And so it's not like you're telling someone, again, that's why the fuzzy idea, the gist of what's valuable to you might change how these these interventions are implemented. And so they did measurements before and after, and they found, again, gains both in cognitive measures and in functional activation measure in frontal areas. But it's a tiny study, needs to be replicated, but it's encouraging that way.
So one of the things that the National Institute of Aging has gotten interested in is the concept of reversibility. And this is the idea, like, one thing that we have learned through all of these correlational studies is we've learned lots of things that happen early in life that create bad, or related to bad outcomes later in life. And we have a real, smorgasbord of these things, poverty, or traumatic birth. There are a bunch of things, poor nutrition, obesity, all of these things have downstream negative effects. And it seems like the science has really established them. Then the question is, how many of these are reversible? So, if you smoke for 20 years and then you stop cold turkey, we know that there are certain kinds of recovery that goes on in your lungs, and you actually, there's a certain amount of that damage is reversible. But what we really need to do, it seems to me, is parse those things that are reversible in this sort of terrible things early in life, terrible things later in life, and think about the things that are not reversible, because those are the targets for early interventions and prevention. And otherwise, I have a feeling we're going to be doing a lot of good-intentioned things later in life that aren't going to really have any impact because the damage has already been done. And I think, now we may disagree on this, but I think our vascular systems are really these things that just accumulate injury throughout our lives. And we understand the mechanisms by which these injuries to the endothelium create magnets for the lipids that lead to atherosclerosis, and I don't think that's reversible. I mean, I'm going to make that and so if you're trying to target that kind of a process, and just for argument's sake, you grant me that it's not reversible, then your intervention has to be much earlier on, but if that's wrong, and you really can undo that, and you have like a psychological statin that somehow, cleans out the arteries, then it makes more sense to get older people up dancing. And my point is that if we don't know that, then we're doing a lot of things that are well-intentioned, but may just gain us no traction.
So let me say a few things. First of all, let's say I can even buy it's not reversible, but stopping something in aging, it's almost equivalent to reversible because you still gain lifespan. So instead, if you have 2 years to live that way, and if you stop smoking, you live 4 years, or you are 4 years away instead of 2 years away from going in a nursing home or in assisted living, it's both economically and humanity, from a human level, a gain. That's one thing. The other thing is that I completely agree that, and that was a point that I was trying to make today, that a lot of this stuff is not an effect of aging, it's an effect of cumulative things that occur through life. And that instilling good habits early and good behaviors early is actually much more valuable than waiting until you're 65, to start that. But that said, it seems like policy goes against this. So in Champaign, a lot of the schools, to keep up with the academic standards that are raising, deleted phys ed classes. So there are all these kids now who do not have, they play video games at home, so they sit down and play instead of playing outside. And on top of that, they don't even have PE at school. And these are the kids that I was referring to. This is, again, not my research, but there are these kids who you look at age, elementary school age, that already have effects of fitness on the hippocampus. How are they going to fare in terms of aging? So this is the place where you can, even in terms of public policy and in terms of intervention, you can certainly do it. But the other aspect of it, the only part of what you said that I don't completely agree on, is the part that the late intervention, when it can gain or slow down a process, is not beneficial. Think of Alzheimer's. If you can stave off Alzheimer's 10 years, most people will be dead for other causes and will never experience. No, I'm not joking, actually. They'll never have Alzheimer's. They'll never experience the drama and the horrible thing of losing one's mind. I mean, my mother is 88, 87, and start having signs of dementia, and I feel like I'm losing her as she is alive. If she could have 2 more years at that age, where she is intact, like my dad is, for example, it would be an enormous gain from every point of view, economical, humanitarian, and so on. So I think that interventions that even slow down processes in aging are actually important.
That would be wonderful, but I'm just saying we should really think about the data and choose our target. So I can tell you that in animal models, where you have lots of accumulation of amyloids in the brain, and you can clear them out chemically. I've never read a study that showed any difference in the animal's ability to run a maze. So by the time the amyloids start appearing in the Alzheimer brain, that's the end stage of the disease. That's not a reversible. Yeah. So I mean, it might make us feel good to put our loved ones on Aricept, which is the human analog of that. But there's no data that suggests it reverses anything. So I think things like that are really. They're misguided, and I think that they're not a good use of our scientific horsepower. I think we should focus on, again, the things that are reversible we should reverse, the things that are preventable we should prevent, and then the rest of it is just hand-holding and might be useful, but it isn't a really good use for the science.
So let me come back to framing the question a bit more, because I think one could argue that having a positive impact on behavior at any point in the lifespan or on the progression toward problem could be beneficial, and there are reasons to do it, and there are humanistic reasons, and we don't want to ignore that. And there's lots and lots of evidence for any dimension of learning or health. But I think there's also this idea of if we would aim at targets that are closer to some tipping point or critical process, that we may get a bigger impact. And that's not to say we should only do that, but if we're going to highlight where science can really help with limited resources. And so you talked about inactivity as a part of this. And yes, it's true that a lot of kids are becoming inactive. But again, if you step back and look at the population data, when do kids start becoming inactive? When do they start becoming sedentary? And it's really between 5th and 8th grade. I mean, young kids, you have to tie them down. They're going to be active, okay? And then what's interesting, and it's a bit of a paradox, because it's right at the time that a subset of kids are becoming passionate about particular sports and being more active at a higher level. And it's also in exactly what the teachers in education, they talk about the 5th grade slump and the 8th grade cliff of engagement, even the kids that are struggling. So I think from a position of motivational learning, I think one could argue that this period, and I think it's like, I was thinking about your graph from about 11 to 14, is when that gist processing is starting to override this, more detail-based, rational processing. And so I think that there's some really interesting questions that cut across levels that suggest, and again, I confess my bias about focusing on developmental windows like the onset of adolescence, but I do think that this could be relevant to trajectories that then impact other points of the lifespan, and the transition to old age might be another really key inflection point. And even if we could do this at any point in the lifespan, I think there could be some value in focusing on windows of time when the right nudge or push or set of nudges, to go back to Keith's I think really provocative presentation about language, because you think about having 10,000 nudges to thinking differently or having temporal processing differently. I think those are other ideas that I'd love to think about. How do we use science to amplify some of these, what we think could be really helpful?
I wanted to share a thought that I've been having throughout these 2 days, and I'm not 100% sure where this is going, but I'm just going to share it, and maybe it'll lead someone else to say something intelligent. This whole conversation has been so different to the types of conversations that my colleagues engage in. And just, for example, this whole question that you're talking about, I keep thinking, well, what the problems that we have within the United States and within the world are disparities across race, social class, and we see some people are living longer, and some kids are doing better, and some kids are doing worse. It's actually striking, the difference across race with increases in obesity, increases in fast food intake, and so how does that tie into this? And how do we go about making change with that? So I guess I'm also thinking about it at that level, and it seems like this group here, and by bringing different disciplines together, you're really uniquely situated to look from the brain to the society, which is very attractive now for funding. And also you've got this unique, I've never actually met a group that's looking at 2 age groups. People usually look at childhood and adolescence, but it's been so interesting to me to think about the similarities and the differences between those 2 groups. So I just wanted to throw that out there because, yeah.
Just one observation about reach and dissemination. The art of public health practice is finding the teachable moment. And what the teachable moment means is value and an opportunity to convey information when people are receptive to hearing it. And we've known for a long time in public health that knowledge alone it's a necessary but insufficient condition for behavior change. And so the whole issue of, what do we mean by teachable moment? How do we identify those and so forth, I think is really kind of a root issue here. And yet, having said that, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to anything much more than simple convenience of being able to capture a large group of people. And so, for example, with pediatric vaccination, there's nothing magical about getting vaccinated when you're 6 years old, okay? It's just that's a period where almost all children in our culture have contact with an institution that can enforce vaccination. And most any pediatrician will tell you that. So there's also the convenience issue involved in that. But I think back to your original question about what grabbed us here, I'm looking at Keith. Using language as a linguistic frame for decision making and intertemporal choice. I mean, Mitch and I were sitting back there and immediately wondering if you had any good data in relation to addictive behaviors that could speak to how this may fit in with that, because that's our content area. But we also were asking the bigger question of, wouldn't it be interesting to look at verbal talk therapies from the perspective of analyzing it the way that you have? Because so many cognitive behavioral therapies, going all the way back to Albert Ellis and people like that, they're all about the reframe. And there's just not been any systematic, I think, examination of it from the point of view about how are we capturing time in that context and the way that you're talking about. And if I were going to pick one, we were talking about motivational interviewing, because that's something where you, quote, meet the client where they are right now and go from there. And you'd want to do it with one that is easily disseminatable and has a good evidence base. But we just really were curious about, looking at verbal behavior in the context of a therapy situation and where your analysis would take us.
So I can briefly speak to what kind of data would be available and where there. So there are, I think, really, really top-notch kind of computational linguists. So for example, like Mark Lieberman at the University of Pennsylvania, and some who have gathered large amounts of data. So for example, large amounts of Facebook data. I don't understand. It seems like college undergraduates these days don't, fame / infamy / privacy, none of these concepts seem to apply anymore. And so, you get them to come into your class and you say, well, would you mind, friending me, right? Your professor. Well, one, that I don't know why that's supposed to sound attractive. And then let me basically analyze everything that you write on Facebook. And so there's a lot of content analysis that goes on. You would have thought that also makes people self-conscious, right, about what they write on Facebook. But apparently, quite quickly, it reverts to, pwang. I don't know, some kind of, hip slang that I don't know. But there are a lot of, and the kind of questions that they ask is they're interested in, so I'm obviously looking at kind of differences across language structures, but I'm starting to talk with people who are very interested in individual differences in usage of language, and hard to design interventions that nail causality, but whether the time path of differences in usage track differences in addictive behavior, track differences in kind of individual decision making, I think is an open question that's potentially quite interesting. Even if you think that it serves primarily as a diagnostic tool, for example, right? There are people who work on using kind of contagion models of particular types of linguistic communication within kind of friend networks to identify causality. But now I've exhausted my knowledge of that literature. Okay, all right, yeah. Yeah, but I think it's a fascinating question and potentially doable. Okay.
I think, there would be an opportunity here to run an experiment, wouldn't there? To introduce language. I mean, it's public. There's probably, other people are talking. So, I mean, you could experimentally induce a future orientation or a present now orientation and so on. And I guess I'd like to ask the sort of provocative question. How much can we go beyond K? In other words, if you conceptualize this as, present versus future and continuity of self, that goes a little bit beyond K, but how much are economists and other behavioral scientists thinking beyond, if this is just a discount function over time, the end? Is that really what it is, or is there more to it than that? Again, I don't want to raise extraneous mentalistic concepts if they're not evidence-based, but...
I can say something very briefly towards this. So it is, and I think this is often something that, so James has experienced this. I think I also experienced this, that, that oftentimes economists in our work seem a little bit reductive, right? We come, there's the discount feature, there's the risk parameter, there's, we try and kind of simplify models of human decision making into kind of things that we can take to data, but that feel very reductive. I agree that I think in some sense, like reducing intertemporal choice, or even just the term intertemporal choice, right? Categorizing a wide variety of kind of decision making down into a frame like this is a little bit reductive. I do actually think that there are some interesting distinctions in which, so for example, many cognitive psychologists, like Pinker being one of being the most prominent, like use subtle variations in language as a mirror to kind of look at cognitive processes. I think there's a little bit of possibility in the direction. I'll briefly say one kind of thing that I've thought about in this direction that I believe is stalled, but that I think is potentially interesting. So there are languages. Okay, so we all speak kind of Indo-European languages. Presume you all look like Indo-Europeans to me, so in Indo-European languages, time structure attaches to the verb, right? Like a prefix or a suffix to the verb in Romance languages, sometimes a modal auxiliary like will or be going to in English, but it's generally thought to modify the verb. I had started this project where there are actually quite a few languages where instead of attaching to the verb, tense attaches to the subject. Like the prefix or the postfix attaches to the subject descendant. So kind of many of you, if any of you speak Hausa, that's an example, right? So like zani, za, na, like it's almost more like literally saying future me run instead of I ran, or past me run instead of I ran. And I had thought that whether or not you could then, in some sense, use this linguistic variation as a way of, in big data, breaking down which kind of intertemporal choices kind of load more on almost like a self-visualization in the future versus which may more be kind of dependent on a generalized K kind of model. I wrote a working paper on this, and the linguists savaged it. They thought it was a terrible distinction. So it is a relatively easy thing to measure, right? Like, does the prefix attach to the subject or the verb? And I think they had some relatively sensible criticisms as to whether or not that translates to a cognitive distinction, and there being very little evidence of that. So, for example, in English you can say, "I'll see you there," and what you're doing is contracting the future carrier will onto the subject I. Does that mean that you're saying future me will see you there, right? Or is that cognitively different? I got really hit over the head with that example at several conferences. But I think it's possible. I think it's possible to move beyond K. Okay.
Thank you. Is that working? Okay. One of the things we haven't talked about is the past. And I don't know how many of you, probably most of you, are familiar with Zimbardo's work and the time paradox book and the Zimbardo time perspective inventory, and they also look at past time perspective and how that dominates what you do in the present and so forth. And he lays out, based on a factor analysis of many different populations, originally, 5 factors, and now they've added the additional transcendental time perspective, which is beyond your own lifespan. And what is interesting about that is there really are reliable differences in behavior pattern as a function of someone's time orientation. And Warren Bickel, who's done the most empirical work in my area on discounting, he's also done it with discounting the past. And you get very similar effects with normal people in the way that they discount the past. And yet we all know from the mental health literature and the clinical psychopathology literature that many problems are when people get fixated on the past. It's not just that you can't orient to the future, but you really get hung up on stuff that happened a long time ago, and that's the nature of post-traumatic stress syndrome and so on and so forth. And I guess I just kind of like to throw out there, where's the past fit into what we're talking about?
And I had another question about language, but maybe did you want to answer? Because I was.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, because I was, I was thinking about cultures that talk about the past and the whole thing with the language, what's cause and effect. So when you were talking about the Mandarin language, is the reason, so you were focusing on the future, present, but I was thinking of things like, are there so many ways to explain that you're going to your uncle's house and what the relation is because that's important in your culture, or because that's important in your culture, are there so many ways of doing that? Because that actually has implications for interventions. And then I was also thinking about things around gender, so some languages have gender and some don't, and how our language has changed. So now we don't say, I think we were talking yesterday about host or hostess or actor, actress. That's changed over time, and why has that changed, and then what's the impact of that change? And then taking it to the public health perspective. So if we, some populations we know have very little language at younger ages. The number of words they know. So is that, again, it's like if you introduce more words, is that, what kind of change will that have? And so I'm just kind of hung up on the cause effect and kind of going beyond the past future. But I was actually thinking, like when like a Native American culture traditionally will say, they won't, instead of saying, what do you do, who is your family? Where are you from? I mean, and other cultures do that, so.
I wanted to just chime in on that too, because I think one of the interesting things that's happening in the way we think about psychopathology now, for example, is we don't really think about things that are inherently good or bad. We think about things that the brain can do, and that in some situations they're useful and some they're not. And Jaylee's point reminded me, like this fixation in the past. So that if you're thinking about if you're reliving a horrible thing that happened to you in Afghanistan and you're having flashbacks, that's a really terrible version of the past. But then let's suppose you're a 70-year-old and you're seeking a source of really sublime pleasure, and it's probably going to be thinking about the past and telling your stories and telling them over and over again, and I think that's almost a universal, and I think I understand why that's so pleasurable for older people, because that's the part of the brain that still works. Those autobiographic memories are very accessible for most people until they die, the things that happen early in life. And, I'm going to tell you a little game you can play. It's we do it in our work, so I'm very sensitized to it. But watch how much time people, as they get into their 60s and 70s, spend trying to find words, trying to remember the names, and the frustration that comes with exercising that part of the brain, which really doesn't work as well anymore. And so the past, that part of the brain, is this wonderful safe haven where you're a virtuoso, and it's where you are brilliant because you remember things that are so far away. And so all of these things, I think, have these different kind of positive and negative endpoints. And of course, part of I think the magic of good behavior change is to optimize on those things. Like, when we talk to families who are dealing with Alzheimer's, we say, look, don't play memory games. You're not going to enjoy your life together. Do something else that they're good at. And I think there's a basic truth there. I don't know.
Fascinating.
Go ahead.
I should say, though, what the data that we've gathered with older people, which I didn't present, on recall and recognition, showed that there is, you're right about the nature of memory change, but most people don't rely on verbatim. They have more false memories than they think. If you went around with a tape recorder and followed them, they think they're remembering things. They're not remembering it so accurately. They actually are relying on the gist more than they realize. Family stories turn out to be fiction. I remember when I was there, except I wasn't born yet, But I remember it vividly, and there's a lot of that. Is the juvenile dementia of adolescence, when it comes to judgment sometimes, is that worse or better than the experienced person's inability to remember a name? I mean, neither, you could imagine contexts in which they'd both not be very good things. So I do think that the data show that there's a lot of reserve. So for example, people were able to generate through reconstructive semantic strategies exact words from a memory list of a neurological assessment test. They were able to do this. They did more and more of it as they got older, but they were able to generate 4, 5, 6 of these words by essentially guessing correctly. Their tendency to output them was below what they could have achieved. So people had different thresholds for outputting that. They were conservative, especially if they thought they had memory difficulties, right? Then they would really hold back from words that they were able to correctly generate from the meaning. So I think there's a lot of potential. I think, based on what Monica said, I was amazed, actually, by what you said about what was potentially changeable in the reserve that was still there that could be improved within the short term. So I guess I'm a cup half full person, but glass half full.
I just want to underscore that there are two different things that we're talking about now. We're talking about what you can do accurately, and then we're talking about what you find pleasurable. And sometimes the things that are really pleasurable aren't very accurate. So, like confabulating about my past and my triumphs, that's enormously pleasurable but highly inaccurate.
So can I throw out let me throw out a 30-second question, because just hearing your guys' comments, I think this is fascinating. Let me throw out a 30-second question. Tell me whether you think this would be an interesting research agenda. Think about kind of a constant cognitive intervention, which asked you to kind of constantly remember in greater or greater detail kind of past events versus not. Actually, there's a good amount of language differentiation on these structures. So, for example, a very widely studied feature of languages with respect to kind of past events, not in tense but in mood and aspect. There's so-called evidentiary languages. A lot of languages have increased evidentiary demands when you're reporting past events. So at the extreme, imagine that whenever you reported a past event, your language forced you, think of these, naively you could think of these as multiple past tenses, but forced you to report whether or not you experienced firsthand that event, or whether you inferred that thing happened because of a later event that you saw it, or whether you were told, like in hearsay, that an event particularly happened. There are languages in some sense that necessitate you in order to be able to speak correctly to, in some sense, access a lot more kind of work, kind of constantly encode and constantly re-encode how you know or what you knew about past events. And I'm wondering if that can be shown to have long-run effects. Turkish, for example. There's a few that have evidentiary systems.
So,
Sounds like a great experiment.
Yeah, right? Or even just comparison, right? Yeah.
So I completely agree with Bob about the affective part of memory, because to some extent, first of all, it will entertain your grandchildren, whether it's accurate or not. And second, unlike the effort of remembering, which is very scary to older adults. Even if you want to stress out an older adult, bring him to the lab and tell them this is a memory task. I mean, they're just not happy, and you really have to be careful to keep tests that even neuropsych tests that will tax them mixed with stuff that they can ace, because otherwise you're going to have nothing in hand, because you're going to just measure their level of stress and nothing else. The other aspect of this is that feeling good will decrease the level of stress and will have an influence on the cardiovascular system. So we are not just making people comfortable, but I think stress levels, whenever older adults need to go through medical procedures or whatever, I mean, there are a number of things that happen in old age that will increase your level of stress just because they're there. Alzheimer's looms large, so whenever every older adults, even the most fit and intact, former faculty professors that come to the lab, some of whom have Nobel Prizes, I mean, these people are still worried about the dementia and about the onset of this, so of aging and Alzheimer's. So I think that what you said, I completely concur. And I think decreasing the level of stress in these kinds of things, whether they're accurate or not, is actually valuable.
So I just wanted to come back to an earlier theme, and then hopefully it will relate to this as well. And I also want to get the postdocs a chance to comment on this, but I'll comment about the conference. But I was recently rereading actually the 2 editions of a book that Joachim Fuster wrote about the prefrontal cortex and doing the neuropsychology and anatomy of these prefrontal cortical circuits. And it was interesting, in his conceptualization of, spending a lifetime studying these, what he emphasized was cross-temporal contingencies, that fundamentally what these circuits were about. And again, I'm not trying to reduce this to the brain. I'm trying to think about the processes and the development of these processes, that it's basically being able to remember things from the past, projecting them in the future to decide what to do in the moment. That these cross-temporal contingencies are fundamentally why you need these complex prefrontal circuits. And I want to bring back the gist idea. It's not like we're going to replay 30,000 memories from the past and project in the future. You need some kind of heuristic, some kind of affective or value heuristic of, and I used the example of medical training. You've seen 12 patients with something like this. You don't have to remember the details. You have a sense, oh, that's probably an infection. That's probably, you have this heuristic based on experience. But I think this is a more general process. And part of the reason that I think adolescence is a particularly exciting time to think about these cross-temporal contingent processes is that the ability to imagine yourself in the future and have that have salience to what you're going to do now is where the dynamic is. It's one of the most exciting things for young people to imagine their grand future and the glory they're going to bring as rock stars and athletes and success. But it's terrifying, and the ability to discount that or not imagine it, and the things like language that influence our tendency to be nudged to think, bringing the future into the present. This is really a pretty central set of processes that are involved in behavior. And sometimes we just do things by habit. But at some level, we are bringing together the past, what we've learned, the future, what we can imagine as the humans with these huge prefrontal cortical circuit capacities to decide what to do in the moment. And it seems to me that understanding how these periods of time when these are developing in new ways or beginning to lose inputs that may have been valuable as a part of this in certain ways, it seems to me like an interesting way to approach integrating across these levels. As you said, looking at the past or just looking at future and present, but all three of them together.
And just quickly, because I don't know much about adolescence, what kind of thinking is pleasurable for an adolescent?
We're not going to go there.
No, but I mean, is it just repetitive thinking or like?
Well, so again, it'd be fun to talk about this, and there's not a lot of agreement. But it does come back. If you remember, one of the factors, the separate factor, was the sensation seeking, and this idea that intensity. Again, huge individual differences. But part of what you were talking about, adolescence. What was the term you used? Not frumping, sulking. Part of what I think accounts for the sulking is when adolescents feel sad, they want to turn the volume up of being sad. They intensify their feelings, and this desire to intensify different kinds of feelings, I think, is part of what emerges in this interval of time. But again, I think a lot of it is about the sense of self, and they have this tremendously rapid shift, a set of shifts in feeling grand about themselves, their future self. They imagine, they play these tapes in their heads of amazing. You probably remember that.
It's all about you.
And then they have one minor experience. The person they have a crush on looks the other way, or they don't make the varsity team, and suddenly it's the opposite. They just imagine that it's hopeless, nothing, that they're going to be a complete failure, and these rapid shifts in their representations of the affect connected to their future self is a lot of the drama that's going on for adolescents. I'm oversimplifying some complex things, but I don't know. I mean, other people that have.
The more and more I think about this, and thinking back to the research, and including Adriana's research, she's not here, but I'm pointing to her chair. Some of the questions we're not asking, I think that your heading there just highlighted so much the questions we're not asking. One of the things we could do is we could ask young people what they do remember that's relevant to the decision they're making. We have very little work on what people remember about the events of their lives. I mean, we may make assumptions about what their experience from the Youth Risk Surveillance Survey or something, but we don't ask the young people, what are you thinking of when you make this decision? What other past experiences have you had that are actually relevant? Looking at directly the relationship between how we construe our memory for our own personal past and the risky decisions we make would be to bring together two literatures that I don't think have ever been connected. It was your statement, actually, that inspired me to think of this.
And I keep thinking about the language. I've never, ever, that's a totally new area for me. But, we talk about, for example, not engaging in fat talk. We talk about that a lot. So not saying I'm fat, or not saying, I want to go on a diet. And I'm just thinking of the links here, and now there's a movement not to engage in old talk. So someone talked about this, not a movement, not to say, and it's something that I've thought about, so not to say, oh, I can't remember, I'm losing my mind, I'm getting old, whatever it is. And these are just different themes that came up here for adolescents. So if you could get people not to talk about drugs as though there's something cool, or talk about saving money, or whatever we're talking about with the future. And then see, does that have an effect on behaviors, attitudes, what's going on in the brain, health outcomes? It could be a very, I'm just thinking about the man who was, I don't see him here, who had the little pots of money that you could do some. Yeah.
Santa Claus Dow.
Well, it sounds like, you never want to say no when someone has something like that, that might be just an idea.
So I wanted to comment on how amazing and exciting it's been to be part of the BCRN and see it grow and develop. I won't say blossom, Bob, because no plant metaphors. Coming to Northwestern, I was really intrigued by a center that I learned about exists there that's called From Cells to Society. And I think you guys are nodding, so you've heard about it. And so one of the things I just want to throw out there, whether there's something to be learned, from these centers that feature people from multiple disciplines, learn from them what has enabled them to work together and what are the things that haven't worked maybe. So that seems like an interesting thing to do. And one of the really interesting and unique things about the BCRN is, I think that was mentioned already, the combination of these two periods in the lifespan, adolescence and late life, that are rarely, if ever, brought together. And there are so many, research questions or questions for conferences one could think about, where these two, people who do research on these two life stages could meet and talk to each other. I just want to mention three things that came to my mind. So the first is really looking at, and I think Bob mentioned that, this question of reversibility. And you mentioned, some of these things that are really problematic in late life, they begin, very, very early in life. It begins, with a moment an adolescent decides to, hang out on the couch and watch TV, not go out, or even earlier. But I do think that in order to really get an understanding of this question, we do need longitudinal data analysis. And I don't think that we have very good data to actually track these lifespan developmental trajectories. And so we've been doing some work where we're looking at cognitive activity over the lifespan, and we're seeing interesting effects that are specific to life stage in terms of neurodegeneration and effects on amyloid accumulation and vascular pathologies. And different stages in the lifespan are kind of like put you at risk for developing certain kinds of things. But I think there are so many open questions here that I think would really benefit from, more research and more talking to each other. So that's one example. And the second one, talking about memory and language, what is really interesting, and talking about reminiscing the past, there's some research on the reminiscence bump effect that means that a lot of things we remember are actually occurring in adolescence and in young adulthood. So if you think about the 70-year-old person who thinks back, what is the time in their lives that they're most likely to think of? It might be, like going to the prom and, having the first girlfriend and all of these things. And so there's actually a connect that people make within their own lifespan between these two age periods. So that's a second interesting thing. And the third one is more biological based. I think Bob and in the work that we've been doing with dementia patients, sometimes we've been really struck by how some of the systems that seem to go offline in some of the dementias, like frontotemporal lobar dementias, are the systems that are coming online in adolescence. Like we see a lot of prefrontal impairment and some of the dementias with consequences for risk-taking behavior, for emotion regulation, for empathy, and all of these aspects that are things that are developing in adolescence. So it seems like connecting researchers to talk about the biological changes that take place in the brain in adolescence and in late life and healthy and pathological aging, and the consequences that has might reveal some surprising convergence between these two. Seemingly different, but perhaps not so different periods in the life.
I was thinking one of the things that I got from this conference, and what I didn't really think about before, but it's really understanding, I think the mechanisms of this teachable moment that you've been talking about. So, and really, what seems to be really interesting also from public health perspective and what would be efficient to spend your money is really do controlled experiments to see when, and I think, of course, for me also with my background, where in adolescence, for some of these, where you have the most efficient time point and to where your intervention has the most effect, right? I think most of those, we do that now sort of gist-based, right? I also think, Valerie, your work, we think, okay, early adolescence is probably a good moment. And this is, or you change the program that was already in existence, and then we do it, but maybe it has more effect if you just did it a year before or a year later. And I think we can really go test that. And I would be also really interested in looking at what's happening, and if you can understand that also at the mechanistic level in the brain, so you're like, oh, but now, now it's exactly, this is the critical period for this sort of gist, and now it's too late, or not too late, maybe. So that's one of the things that made me think about, how can we do that? And that would be really interesting to test, and not really hard to do either. Another thing, which is more unrelated, but I was thinking, it was just more of a question about these gist things also. And it has to do, same with plasticity maybe, because you made that link in the talk. But could it also be you learn the wrong gist? And then, and when you learn that, is it also, is there a window where you can unlearn that? And could it be also too late? Is it harder to unlearn that when you're older?
That's a very interesting question. To give you a very concrete public health example, one that I did some research on both in adolescents, but also in experts. And for example, and some of this it resembles the gist you have in math and science. We have misconceptions that electricity flows, so we think of it sort of pouring out of a socket. Apparently that's wrong. But, but that's like a mental model we have that's misleading, that leads to all kind of bad predictions about how electricity works. So similarly, like in public health, one of the things I looked at was misconceptions about what do condoms do that protect you against sexually transmitted infections. And most people's mental model, the gist for most people is it's a physical barrier to fluids. And germs are transmitted in these fluids, sort of like boats on on a notion. And they ride along, and this is how these things happen. It turns out, of course, that there are very common viral diseases like herpes and papillomavirus and things like that that are skin-to-skin transmission. So the notion that condoms would be effective there turns out to be a misconception. So the gist of this, so fluid-borne works for the things that are fluid-borne, but it's a misconception for these other things. So even some of the experts, not the top experts, no, would get this distinction because they had a different mental model. You know, again, it's having a different sort of knowledge of why something happens. This has also happened in cardiovascular disease, for example. People have gone from a blockage model of cardiovascular disease to an inflammation model. So now cardiologists have to rethink their metaphors. Is it something that just gets wedged into the wall and blocks something, or is it a systemic disease where there's inflammation? That's like a different gist. It's a different way of conceptualizing it. I think the human mind is enormously plastic. I think there's been lots of work now, showing that there's neuronal development in adults, post-stroke, post-trauma, into old age. There's tremendous upside potential and the nice thing about GIST is it tends to be conserved and robust. So you can have a lot of neurological damage, and we've just, in fact, published a paper on some of the neural substrates associated with this. And yet you're able to put together, it's almost like a hologram, shades of Carl Prevrum. It's almost, pieces of it can be missing from the mental trace for events, and you still have this robust ability to reconstruct the event that is amazingly robust and can be maximized strategically, I think. So yes, we can change people's theory of events. We do it all the time. People do change in terms of how they conceive of things. They have to have some insight. We have to help them. We have to think more about meaning than we have in the past to the individual, but I think it's absolutely doable.
Can I make a comment about GIST that was one of my free associations when you were talking about this, and I think it may reconnect things back to the question of where does emotion fit? How many of you have had an argument, for example, with a colleague where all of a sudden you notice that they're really getting upset because you're questioning something and they're having an emotional reaction to it? Oh, never. Yes, I know. And rationally, you don't get it because it's a provable piece of information or not. And I was sitting there thinking, you have assaulted their gist, which is wrong and biased. And I was also thinking, gee, at my age, I better go back and read some verbatim scripts and check things out because it is a form of bias. If it is wrong, you have problems, and it's not analyzed in the way that one might think of a verbatim script and how you approach that. But I just wondered, many of the things we're talking about here do have an emotional component to them and a reaction. The same thing I've experienced with older people when you challenge their memory or if they have, Alzheimer's or something like that, they get very upset. Anyway.
I wanted to pick up on the topic of meaning and emotional components. So I think what's been really interesting to me is this discussion on the one hand kind of about these mechanisms in terms of also the biological mechanisms that maybe adolescents and older adulthood might share. And then on the other hand, this discussion around time and how it might influence our meaning making and our understanding of gist. And I think it will be really important to understand how that also interacts with these biological mechanisms, because it can help us understand how some approaches might be effective in adolescence, but not in older adulthood, because even though there might be some shared mechanisms, these gist or understanding of time and meaning might differ.
Well, and I was just going to add to that. It's been making me think of a couple of things. First of all, I think, Wouter, you made me think about there's no absolute value of gist for some of these things. Like, who are we to say, or who is the public health establishment to say that this is the right thing for somebody? And I think adolescent sexuality is a great place where we run up against that of like, well, when is the right time for a young person to have sex, and who gets to make that gist, and who gets to establish that value, and what are the caveats that we get to like scaffold around that about when is the appropriate time for that? So I think developing that gist is really a complex thing to do, and I feel like I'm sort of all of these talks have been so fascinating at kind of mapping out that link between somebody's cognitive and affective experience, their intention, and then the behavior, and then what the consequences of that behavior, and even the language about how they talk about it. I think that that's a really interesting path that we're always trying to figure out in public health and are continually struggling with. And so I've been trying to think about the places of potential intervention, and I talked to Val a little bit about the place about how do you give somebody how can you train somebody, and how can you give somebody experience where they're going to be able to have an affective response where they can then integrate that into their own gist so they can establish a value for themselves. I mean, I think that that's a really big challenge. And similarly, I was thinking a lot, Keith, when you were talking about, I was interested if you had any data on people who are bilingual or have a language of origin that is different, because if this isn't trainable, if you can't get away from what your language of origin is telling you, then all these ideas that we might have about shifting that framework wouldn't work. So I was interested in hearing a little bit about that.
So there is actually a very rich literature, not in my own work. I think this is a mistake, but I studiously try and throw immigrants and bilinguals out of any data set that I immediately come in contact with, because I worry a little bit about the selection process, right? Like, what kind of people immigrated to this country. But I think it's a potentially fascinating source of variation. And, in fact, so Lara Boroditsky, the kind of some of the work that's in her lab, like the Russian blues experiment that I kind of presented, finds bilinguals often cognitively fall in between the kind of two kind of languages that kind of, to the degree you could identify an effect. I think there are interesting things with respect to the time course. So, for example, like if you look here, the tensile the time when you pick up tensile structure is a little bit earlier than the time that you pick up many other linguistic mastery kind of features. So, for example, if somebody, so I have family members who this kind of describes. If you come to this country post age 8 but pre age 12. Later, you can basically have no Chinese accent, but you'll periodically still catch yourself saying, or other people catch you saying, like, "I go now," or something like the kind of tensile structure is kind of hard to absorb, and questions of looking at immigrants both from whether or not these things, looking at, say, even take the same family, 2 children, one when the family came, one was aged 6 and one was age 10, like what are the differences in later life outcomes? It's I think something I've been encouraged to try and do from this encounter.
So this reminds me of a discussion we had in the behavior change seminar. I don't know whether Mark is still here. I think we talked about how immigrants actually provide a really neat example of studying behavior change, because I mean, and that's actually, I think, a pretty open question, and a lot of us, I think, like to have an international background and can at least draw from some of our own experiences, how living in a different country and speaking a different language, what effect that does have on the way you think, and also like what you eat and all of these things. And I do think that I completely understand throwing out those people, but I do think that these are really some very, very interesting people to look at. And if you want to understand, something about, radical ways of behavior change, why not also use that as a model group to study some of these processes?
I just wanted to come back actually, this was initially a question that Anna raised, and it's about gist that I think links, that may make some connections across this. And we've been using this term very broadly because you've been persuasive in your data and your model, but this idea that actually there could be a set of processes, gist-based processes, and I want to ask, I'll ask it in a concrete way. To what degree are these implicit? To what degree are they explicit? And to what degree are they affectively based heuristics that may have no verbal or language base, or in some cases may actually be a literal script that people have that could be easily malleable, or you need a pattern of experiences to change the implicit or affective based? And it gets back to the competing gist level as well. So.
I am so glad we have this on tape so I can go over this question later, because so much is in that question. I think we have a research plan. And in all the comments here, I'm so glad we're recording this. I can't wait to see this again and think about it. These are all very difficult and interesting questions. I can tell you the things we've tested. A lot of people use the term intuition loosely. We tried to define it. And one of the aspects of intuition that's common to the different theoretical perspectives is this notion of unconscious and automatic. And indeed, when we've looked at some of our memory studies, we've tested models that assumed that you had conscious control over the gist. You could bring it, you could use it and not use it based on it. Well, you can't. It turns out that those models don't fit the data. It often has this unconscious effect on your behavior. You think you're not using the gist, you are. It's influencing your choices, and we can see it in the data. So that's at least in the limited situation. It doesn't mean you can ask people what's the gist of these options, and they will be able to summarize the gist for you. And in the old days, in many, many psycholinguistics and in linguistic studies, there were many, many experiments on this. So we know that, for example, asking people to summarize a narrative, getting what they remembered after a long-term retention interval, and then looking at the story grammar and looking at the high nodes in the story grammar, all three measures tend to converge. But the use of gist itself in decision-making and memory is often unconscious and automatic and out of our awareness. So that whole thing is very interesting. And then the rest of it was about misconception. I'm sure.
Well, if you take seriously this idea of more difficulty at a later period in development or expertise to change it, then is the route to change? It gets back to your model. If these are operating largely as unconscious, more automatic processes, then there's, like in other areas, is it a training experience into that system that's necessary to change it, and that all our efforts to explicitly change it could be actually backfiring?
Yes, I think, again, I hearken back to some of the earlier work by people in the Gestalt tradition, because I think they had a lot of really good ideas that we've kind of overlooked. And one of the things they emphasize, and learning, we don't talk much about learning anymore. Learning needs to come back, right? And people can change, but there are these fact-based, very rigid things that people can, they can do exactly what they were trained on, and I think that's the difference between training and education, right? Training is I memorize the right answer, I can do that, I don't retain it too well, and I'm very rigid, right? Transfer is this thing where you have insight, and it's basically all about why. And this is why there's a connection between fuzzy trace theory and construal level theory and other things that say encoding the why behind the events. You have some sense of, but why did that happen? So narratives are important as part of this. Narratives often explain why. The parables and the stories that people tell are not just to describe, they're to explain. How did we get here? So you have an origin story that explains why we're here and what the purpose, So those kinds of things are different ways to try to get at why. The notion of experience, and again, Anne and I were having this conversation too, I think that's so important. And I don't think I have the answer to this one. I don't think I even have most of the answers here, but I think this perspective raises new questions in a new way. So how does experience give you insight? It's not just you sat in the factory and you made the widget and you made 10,000 widgets, so now you're smarter than when you made 10 widgets. It's not like that. So it's not memorization and pure association. It's something about experience gives you insight. And I would suggest to you, by the way, that we not be so hesitant about sharing with young people the insights we've gained from experience. It's not that it's all equally good answers to what they're going through. That's really not true. We're not, we can tell them more than that. It doesn't mean we dictate to them and they have no autonomy and that there might not be different perspectives. But when you sit down and people look at each other who've been through things in life and say, yeah, right? We can share that with young people. There's some insights that really we can share with them that will help them maybe minimize some of the regret and the heartaches and the bad consequences.
I had a really interesting discussion with Adriana last night, though, and we were talking about the fact, though, that we live in a culture that values youth. And she said, if I could do one thing and look back at myself, I would tell myself to take more risks as an adolescent. And I think that's an interesting thing of like the time that we have all this opportunity, and actually the fearlessness or whatever you want to call it to take some of these risks and learn from the affective experience and integrate that into it. It's interesting that we live in a culture where people are trying to always regain that and they can't go back. And some people they wish that they could be as young and as strong and smarter. Like a lot of people say that, but a lot of people wish that you hear people say like, I wish I could take that chance again. I wish I could go back and be an undergraduate again and, just explore all there is to learn. I could, that you're not so limited. And so I think it's a hard place to be in our current society.
So one thing that occurs to me as this conference has moved on is that we really have become, we're having a discussion about the frontal lobes. And whether it's gist or whether it's, more of a procedural, parametric kind of calculated thought, we really are talking about a part of the brain that arrived pretty late in evolution. And I think it's just the nature of the people who were here and the talks that we heard that we're doing that. But in this equation of behavior and behavior change, it's really important to remember that there's a huge part of the brain that isn't the frontal lobes, and that it's this phylogenetically ancient part of the brain, and we're calling it now occasionally the value or the emotional tone or something. But that part of the brain is constantly giving us information and telling us what to approach and what to avoid, what's likely to be safe and nurturant and what's likely to be harmful. And we're awash in that information, and we call it our gut feelings or intuitive feelings that's been thrown around. And one of the interesting things about that part of the brain is it ages really well. I mean, it's been around forever. And it's going to be around in our ontogeny as well as our phylogeny. And so, in late life, as the frontal lobes start to really age prematurely, these parts of the brain really are still quite powerful. And older people are often going back and relying on these very primitive feelings about making decisions based on, you just seem like a nice guy, so I'm going to do what you say. You, not so much. I'm not going to do it. And so that conversation inside us between these ancient primitive brain centers and then these ones that are coming online later on, it's always part of what makes this such changing behavior so difficult. And I just wanted to put that as a bookmark that in these 2 days we didn't talk much about that, but it's a huge part of what determines what we do. And go.
So I have to. It's so rare that it's not the disagreeing, but I just want to push. I want to push. I think that.
Was a nice guy, but
yeah, exactly. I've got to correct that. So I think, and it's going to get back to this idea. Get this negative face as I try. But to get to the point, I think
your ancient brain.
It is my ancient brain. I actually think we will be better served moving beyond talking about regions of the brain and back to the idea that these frontal circuits connect all of these brain regions, including these old affective systems. And the key part of some of these affect heuristic gist processing are links between this ability to imagine the future, the past, and how you feel about it and value them. And I think even in terms of the language of it, it's a subtle difference, but I think Keith really made this point 3 or 4 times. It's not whether you're future-oriented or present-oriented. It's the languages that obligatorily pull the future into the present. It's linking the future to the present. It's not whether you're future or present-oriented that really seems to be the key part of this, what he described. And I think that it's not simply whether you have frontal lobes that do abstract processing. It's these frontal circuits that link abstract, goal-relevant, self-relevant processes to these deep feelings of value. And I think that these circuits, it's less about regions of the brain and more about circuits that link these different systems together in effective ways, and that they're harder to change later. So it's a subtle difference from what you're saying.
It's a very
agreeing.
big difference.
But
in what I'm saying, it's the Freudian idea. There's the id and the superego, and they're both chatting away, and then the ego is deciding which one to listen to. It's a very different model. No, I totally respect that's a different way of thinking at it. And I think if we knew which one really was at work at a given time, we would have much better strategies for behavior change. And it's also possible that your brain is doing that.
And yours.
Where's the horseman?
Wait, actually, I'm going to go back to this side of the table in terms of not only that the postdocs are closer to the latest integrated of neuroscience, but I'm getting just to get some of your thoughts and reactions, Jeff. Not to put you on the spot, but this idea of thinking about these cognitive and frontal systems, and then the integration in circuits.
I mean, one thing I guess is that I think we do know that it is always a circuit. Like, you never have a neuron alone doesn't do anything. It's in the dark. It doesn't know anything. It's working together with a bunch of other neurons. So it is always a circuit, and it might just matter that you lose one part of the circuit. That might be the important thing, So that's something that fits both of your perspectives, I think. But I think it is a circuit, and you have to think about what happens to the circuit when you lose that, not just that you lose that and then whatever's associated with that is sort of gone. You can have compensatory things, or the compensatory things that you do might be worse than, just not doing it at all. Like going with this, oh, you look like a nice guy, I'm going to let you into my house, and you have a big black bag full of something, and that's not a good idea. So I think that's important to think about whatever the particular circuits you're thinking about are. They don't have to be Ron circuits, although I like Ron circuits, but they don't have to be those. But I think that's important to and that's something that isn't in neuroscience as much as it should be. Is this, or it's more in like cellular level neuroscience rather than the sort of stuff that I do. But there's like graph analysis or other things that are coming out now that help you do that, and that you can create these models and then do computational lesions where you take them out and then you can see what is the effect, like how is information transfer throughout the brain affected, things like that. What's your response, Bob?
I wish I knew the answer, but I do think in times in life it does feel like there's a panel that's competing for the microphone. And that's a real experience. And so you may never have had that, but but other times it feels like it's this throbbing organism that's all in perfect synchrony. But I think that it's because the brain is capable of. There are moments of great convergence, and then there are moments where these different computational circuits are really coming up with different answers, and then something is deciding how to behave or how not to behave. Often is what we're talking about.
Or at least it's not necessarily something, but it's like a horse race where something wins out overall, and that's what you do. But there is nothing, I think, that there's areas like the frontal cortex is largely involved in biasing other areas to decide what you're going to do. So you could say that that's in part, deciding what, but it's not necessarily. It's just whatever the horse race is, whoever wins.
And I just want to add, and it actually makes a link back to one of the things that Val said about training, and that is that there clearly is evidence for bottom-up versus top-down influences in these circuits. And one of the simplest ones is attention. I mean, you can have fear activate your attention bias, and you can have top-down processes activate the same thing. And so clearly there are, you can think of areas of the brain that have more primitive levels of processing or affective processing that bias these systems. But the relevance of this gets back to when you said training, you were thinking in rigid ways about learning. But I was actually thinking about attentional bias training, which can happen with implicit processes. You can reward people for looking at positive faces rather than negative faces, and you begin to alter some of the sort of affective heuristic processes. And in certain periods of development, these have greater impact on the bias in the systems. And working from the bottom up, working on these lower level affective systems and retraining them to their tendencies to look at positive versus negative can be a more effective way to alter the balance or tendency in the system than telling people to think positive thoughts or reframe cognitively. Or other situations where it's the reframing that's more powerful.
I think it's important to make a distinction between metacognitive, telling people to do something consciously, which is a whole other thing that may be completely disconnected from what they're really doing. So telling people to do things and then them consciously doing it, there's a whole science of that, of metacognition. versus when you're giving them images, are they learning only the images you train, or are you trying to get them to connect some dots? So do you want them only to know, to memorize the positive images you specifically trained, or do you want them to generalize in the real world? Mostly we want people to generalize, right?
So the classic example in my mind is, Colin McLeod took Asian students coming to Australia and randomly assigned them to alter their attention to positive versus negative in this implicit learning process, and then looked at their stress during their first year of college in Australia and had significant effects. So it's generalizing. It's not simply you're learning to look at the positive features in this little task. It's a real-world example at this point in life. It's one example, but I think it connects to what Bob is saying, that by altering some lower-level process through learning and experience patterning, rather than telling people to reframe cognitively. Yes, or giving them cognitive behavioral therapy to help them with practice and structure and scaffolding to focus on this larger framework, which again has huge positive effects, but it's a different approach to how to alter, it's back to changing behavior. And the idea that as we think about these circuits and think about what are the targets to try to have a positive impact, I'm saying even though I don't think we should talk about areas of the brain, I think that even within a circuit model, you could be focusing on parts of the circuit that are more affective or more primitive processing or fast processing, or more complex cognitive or metacognitive processing.
Yeah, and I think this is where psychological science or social science really can learn from the economists, because we tend to study this in these very kind of safe environments. So I take a kid who's not very hungry and say, would you like a marshmallow now or two later? And the stakes are really low. Ask that kid to do that when he hasn't eaten for 6 hours, and then you're going to get a very, very different, ability to override that. And I think what the economists have told us is you have to turn the gain up in the system. You have to have high stakes to really understand, to scale up this behavior into the kinds of problematic situations that these life-determining decisions are made in. Whether to cheat on your wife, or to eat that horrible food when you're starving, and all of these things where there's strong drive states. It seems to me like we can practice in these kind of disembodied versions, but when we're in the moment where life is really talking to our striata in powerful ways, that's what we need. That's when we need to make these top-down decisions that are going to determine trajectories, and we aren't very good at modeling those in our research. We aren't allowed to be very good at it, but we have to get better at it. Otherwise, we're studying the capacity for top-down modulation when there's not that much to modulate. And I don't think it was.
Can I add something here? Oh, I've got one. Thank you. I'm always suspicious of computer models of the human brain, and I think we've been spending a tremendous amount of time talking about thinking. And where does meditation fit into this? Ceasing that internal dialogue. Why do we have to talk ourselves through decisions? A lot of times people do stuff and then create a post hoc scenario about why they did it. And I think that this notion of, rational decision making where we think first and then we act is kind of what eggheads think. That's our default, if you will. When in the real world, I think a lot of times people do things, they don't really know why they did them. I mean, I don't. So I guess I'd just like to raise that as an issue. What is the utility? Why does meditation help people? And why do Eastern religions generally tell us to live in the present and not get sucked into the future and back in the past too much? I mean, where does that fit into this discussion?
Because I told you I have this strong interest in yoga, and I was thinking about that when they were talking, but I didn't want to say anything, so I'm so glad you said something.
Sorry.
Because the whole philosophy is actually to listen less to what's going on in the top of your head and more what's going on inside of your body. And you were talking about the lower level, and yeah. So I was just thinking about that also. Yeah. And it's kind of a link between the physical activity and the. I didn't go ahead.
Well, first off, it's been great listening to all of you guys talk about this. Jaylee and I have been working on behavior change research in a group that runs a conference every year for the last 10 years or so, and it's a big animal, and it has so many dimensions, and it's one of these onions that the more you peel it, the more you realize there's layers and layers and layers, and it just gets challenging to study. But one of the just my comment on the meditation piece is I think that really does tie into the role of arousal and affect, and there is this premise that as arousal increases, that people's opportunities to have a wider behavioral repertoire narrows, and so when you're reaching higher and higher and higher arousal, your choices of how you're going to respond in that moment are getting fewer and fewer, and to the point where when there's a snake that comes out on the trail when you're hiking, you have really no choice in that moment, but you're going to jump to the side. Like, you can't think your way through that. And the premise then is that if you can reduce arousal, you're going to increase your behavioral repertoire, that you'll have more choices in front of you, that you can make a choice, that your executive function, your frontal lobe, your top down will have a chance to be the one that kind of wins the battle. So I think largely that's one of the key mechanisms that the meditation and the mindfulness literature is looking at, is this idea that you're generally decreasing arousal, and that you're giving people an opportunity then to learn how to experience that sense of decreased arousal that they carry with them in other contexts, and that they can then have a wider opportunity to choose what behavior is going to be most adaptive in that situation. So I think it's a great question, and I think one of the things that comes out of, if I just add something, one of the things that comes out for me of the discussion is that one of the issues is, what are the targets? And Ron, you kind of raised this a few times, and like, what are the targets? And we've talked about in our group a lot of like, what are the mechanisms? Like, what is it? We've been trying to distinguish between the acts that we do with people, the interventions, the conditions, the messages, as being one domain, and those have certain sets of ingredients that we think are affecting things. And then there's another domain, which is how are people actually changing in response to those. And in that response are these mechanisms. And it's this big black box. What are the targets or the mechanisms that are actually underlying what then result in some kind of change in people's behavior? And we can really hit at those, I think, at a multiplicity of levels, and that's where it gets really complicated, because they can be social, or they can be influences on people's behavior directly. They can be changes in valuation. They can be changes in arousal. They could be changes in the brain. They could be engaging in new behaviors, and it just. I think that focusing on what those mechanisms are, like what's your theory about what those mechanisms are, ends up driving your next question. And usually what our experience has been is, like, we don't often ask that question in that way. And so we end up trying to answer it, but then we look at these studies that we've designed, and they've actually asked a different question. They've asked, like, does our intervention affect depression? But we don't really know why it affected depression. We have assumptions about why it affected depression, but it doesn't always come to be that way. And like, there have been some interesting meta-analyses of cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction, and it's really not supporting the idea that it's changing coping skills and that it's changing cognition. So we're left scratching our head going, why does cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction work? Because the mechanism we thought it was hitting wasn't doing it. And we only got at that because people started looking at the mechanism, and they tried to, glean that. And then it raises the question of, so what's the mechanism? Or like what you're saying, what's the target? And so that's the thing that our group is constantly working at, to try to get people to focus on what the mechanism is that they're studying. And it's not easy to do. And so that's part of the challenge. But I'd like to see things kind of move in that direction, identifying candidate mechanisms that are really responsible for the change.
Open it up more broadly. While the microphones are out, other people in the audience have comments. It's been a wonderful discussion. I can call on people.
So this is kind of another tangent, so it doesn't relate to that. So if you guys wanted to respond to that, then should we do that, or should I? Okay. So one of my I'm developing an interest in how technology can be used for behavior change. And if you think about things like the Fitbit or something that people are using, these wearable technologies for tracking their exercise, and we know that when people track their weight, they're more likely to lose weight. And one of the things that I'm interested about that related to this is I think it has the potential to connect to the self in a way that I think Ron was talking about really early in the discussion, and about how people collecting data about themselves, how we can help connect some ideas like exercising makes you feel good or something like that, to actually, give them data that shows them that it is connected to themselves. And I was wondering, if anyone had any other thoughts about that or not.
Well, just a quick comment to link into some of the discussion yesterday, and that is that, and this is going to be true for any technology, is that it's double-edged. And so there are areas where with sleep and weight, actually monitoring can backfire. It can actually create worse. And so I think the issue, it comes back to what's the model and where can, in what situations and in what populations and in what age groups and contexts does the right kind of technology or policy level nudge have a clear positive effect, and in what, but as soon as we get too narrow or naive about that, we can find some surprises where it backfires. And I think that gets back to the model, and actually, as you were describing, coming up with targets and mechanisms where we're pretty confident that if we can nudge something in this direction, in this way, that we will have a positive impact on behavior. And I think that's part of what makes it exciting to have such an interdisciplinary group.
This is a little slow on the uptake, but I was just thinking, it's not exactly, it's more stimulated by the prior question, but I was just thinking about psychotherapy research and 50 years of that, and it seems like you'll probably disagree with this, but if I had to integrate it all, I would say that it doesn't make any difference what you do. I mean, the specific techniques.
Well, I agree completely.
Yeah, well, you and I we had the same training, so of course we agree. Yeah, I mean, we were both involved we were right there when that work was both starting. And so it doesn't really matter the specific operations that the healer does, but what makes the difference is the connection between the healer and the sick person. And it underscores another part of this behavior change, and that is that, the social context, the interpersonal context, is a powerful influencer around behavior. One of the reasons Ron and I, got interested in these two these 2 points in the lifespan is that we know that the peers are enormously important in adolescence. Well, it turns out in late life, the data suggests that people become very much interpersonally focused again, especially as they step out of the workplace and they get much more interested in the close relationships in their life. And there's these wonderful new research traditions now looking at influences of social networks using these network data analyses on things like eating and drinking and health-promoting behaviors. And so, there's something in this chemistry of other people that is a powerful part of the answer to this thing. And maybe it's not really what any of us do in this panel. I mean, I think we're all thinking about the part that goes on between a person, their problems, and a computer screen, or some proxy for it. But a lot a lot of this stuff gets negotiated in these relationships, and certainly in early, late life and adolescence. Those are enormously powerful, and I think there's a lesson there that's why the therapy stuff always comes back to the interpersonal connection as being the best predictor of whether or not the person gets better.
Well, I also want to link this back to what Stephanie said, and to link to what you said, Bob, is that I am really interested in that peer component, and I think talking about what you're talking about, and then also what Keith said earlier, is that technology is playing into that in a very interesting way. That it is shifting what we're calling a social network and what those relationships look like, what people's identities are within the context of those. You know, if you have a Fitbit and everybody's following you on Facebook, and how people are representing themselves on Facebook, the immediate feedback they're getting. I mean, I think there's a very interesting place there that has an interesting effect at these two lifespan inflection points as well, because we have people who are not, you know, that they are native computer users and native users of social networks that are established through these electronic means. And then we have older adults who are adopters in some ways, and their utilization of these networks is very different, and the type of social support they're getting is really interesting. And so thinking about different ways that we can use technology both as a benefit and also as a research tool. I mean, I think that the mountains of data, I'm sort of toying with the idea of doing a Facebook analysis on some data, and it's so mountainous that it's just really, it's unbelievable the wealth of data we have there, but what do you do with it? So I think there's a lot of opportunity.
It's also kind of interesting to think about we just said about the social networks at the different periods of time. And adolescence is obviously a period where people are, I guess I'm thinking why peers are important in those two periods of time and what some of the differences might be. So for adolescence, I mean, you're actually forming your identity and your peers are helping you form your identity. And I don't know, I don't study the older group, but it would seem to me that there's a big fear of loneliness. And so you want to be with people to not be alone, because your family has left, you're retired, your spouse may or may not be still in your life, whatever it is. So it's that would be kind of interesting to compare that. And I don't know, maybe other people have done that. I'm just.
Actually, no, that's a really good point. I think one of the things to think about is that this whole topic, that relationships matter to health in different ways during different points in the life course. And it's not a uniform thing. That we're finding more recently that among kids, it's really important to have a diversity of people around you, diversity of ideas, and that can really stimulate a lot of really positive change, as well as health negative change as well. But among adults, it can actually be protective to be surrounded with more people that are like yourself. And it's kind of a counterintuitive perspective from some ways of thinking, but thinking about the ways that networks shape our behaviors at different times I think that's a really important area to look at.
Do you have access to both adult and adolescent data sets that could look at that?
And we can test
Yeah,
these
cool.
things, yeah.
Cool. There's your K.
Well, I was just going to follow up. I think I come away from this discussion really convinced that it would be worthwhile to directly compare adolescents and older adults. And, rather than looking at here's studies with adolescents, here's studies with adults, with older adults. I think, ranging from the neurobiology at the level of the brain to the social that we've just talked about and the comparison you just talked about making, I don't know I really think that a direct comparison would be so instructive. I think it's sort of it's probably because I think a developmental perspective is important, but I think these contrasts that we're talking about would be very, very useful to make within the same materials and so on.
I just want to, there are two things that I found interesting. One is relating again to Keith's thing with the language, which is like one of the things that I find interesting in the US, for instance, that the big government and people use that term, and I've never heard little government. And so the power of what that has, and of course that comes partially from a culture to the language, but I also think it reinforces that because I've caught myself also thinking more along those lines since I came here. And I guess in general, just like how it relates to maybe advertisement and other things that essentially create a language or other things around that. Whereas especially in economics, a lot of the advertisement would be about information, giving, I guess, psychologists wouldn't necessarily anyway be particularly sympathetic to that. But I was just thinking that that's one where thinking about advertisement in that sense might be something that one might not want to do quite so much, or especially not have some targeted advertisement to people in a particular group where they are very likely to be influenced, which I think Sweden has some laws on certain kinds of targeting on kids up to a certain age. And the other thing is, though, as an economist, I find it quite interesting that at some point I realized we're never talking about incentives. I think no one talked about incentives in, like, even the economists were talking about the framing or cues, but it was more about kind of nudging. It wasn't about trying to make things either harder or easier, like good behavior, less costly. And I was just thinking what people here think about, nonetheless, whether there's scope for incentive or it just doesn't work because many of these things are long-term and therefore it's very difficult to do the incentives on. Yeah.
So I have heard the term small government conservative, so maybe it's because you're in Berkeley that you've never heard anything but big government. I think as an economist, I do believe the incentives matter, and we have lots of incentives that kind of run around in our society. I guess from a scholarly perspective, to a certain degree, do incentives matter? Yes or no? That's not as interesting as, kind of how much do incentives matter and how much does that cost relative to alternative policies. And so part of my interest in these more psychological nudges is that they are almost free. And so I think that there's a very productive line of research on incentives in general and even incentives in health behavior, although I'm more pessimistic that that's going to be a long-term solution given how expensive it is and our general budget problems anyhow. So I think it's a divide and conquer, gains from specialization kind of thing.
I think something that is understudied and may I think a lot of things benefit from an economist thinking about them, but something in particular that may benefit from an economist thinking about them is the endogeneity and competition among frames when they're kind of released into the wild. In some senses, you're saying, right? So, I mean, we have, as you pointed out, political parties competing on particular frames. If you're going to release a health intervention that's a framing intervention, Burger King has a lot of bandwidth and channel to release kind of competing frames. And I think you see that. So, for example, in the recent kind of Affordable Care Act debate, the quote unquote public option, right, was a very kind of heavily researched and thought out frame. What do we want to call it? Socialized medicine? No, let's call it the public option. You know what I mean? It's a very particular kind of attractive frame, but that I think there is a lot to think about what happens when that kind of endogenously enters a very competitive and incentivized marketplace where there are actors who want to provide competing frames or want to reframe your frame, or I think that's a difficult topic, but perhaps potentially extremely important for thinking about the efficacy of these interventions.
So I just wanted to pick up on one other theme, not from this conference, but the previous BCRN conference that I think relates to this idea, and not in the narrowly explicit framing, but more in this sort of countering message approach. And that's what Emily Falk gave a talk of how by actually doing sort of the neuroimaging version of focus groups, identifying which anti-smoking messages, asking people which anti-smoking message moved them did not predict which messages were effective in different actual real markets. Where looking at some of these neural responses to the messages was a better predictor. And so this idea, how we could, again, think about, whether you want to think about it affective or just processing, how we may go beyond just asking people what, in focus groups is a really fascinating part of what I think emerged from the last conference. And then the second very concrete example of this, is what happened with the Truth in Advertising anti-tobacco, where in fact what was a very interesting intellectual process of making the decision to take big tobacco's advertising imagery and use it with adolescents' sort of rebelliousness and not wanting to be duped, and then countering that in a very intentional way. And that, I mean, in terms of a measurable, impactful approach to public health, changing behavior, that was a single example of what you're talking about. You know, it's like, you know, Burger King responding to McDonald's with, you know, the counter framing. I think there are ways to incorporate these kinds of approaches. We have some examples that are really exciting, and I think there are other ways these kinds of approaches, and again, it takes these kind of interdisciplinary teams who have expertise in these different levels, including the economics, to think, okay, where's the sweet spot that we could, you know, counter a frame or an approach that really could be impactful, and how do we measure that, including things like implicit processes or neural responses, not simply what people say. So.
Mark, I just want to go back to your comment. Really appreciate you reminding us of the role of incentives, and it's a little bit more sort of like reflecting the focus on the super ego in this conference, and maybe neglecting the id a little bit. But I do think that besides financial incentives that you guys are working a lot on, I think there's an implicit understanding here among us that social incentives play a huge role in behavior change. And we just outlined, you know, the importance that social relationships play in adolescence and late life. And we had, and I think you were there, right, George Lowenstein, talk about these different interventions and how they, you know, didn't really work when people were given financial incentives. But what did really work was the role of social incentives or peer support. And so I do think that this is really an important topic that we've only touched briefly in this conference. And I would love for us to have a chance to talk more about it at some point.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. And so Claudia's outlined the next BCRN conference, BCRN 3, the social influence. So if all of you will just stay for a couple more days, we'll start up again tomorrow morning at 9. So thank you all again for coming, our members of the Berkeley community and people who were so kind to accept our invitation and come and visit with us. And wonderful to have our alum postdocs back again. That was really terrific. I'm so glad we could do that. I want to thank Elizabeth Peel again. I think she's still here for doing this organization, and all the people who helped, you know, kind of keep the trains moving. And I think, I don't know, it seemed to me they moved really smoothly. So, you know, let's go out, change us some behavior, and for the better. Thank you again.